Chapter 27.
10 minutes to decant approximate, sir, one of Hung's technicians apprised him. Chenyu Hung turned to his TAC officer. Send word to both Kaj and Matak. I want Brokel on our 3 and Harrell on our 6. We will proceed to tie formation immediately upon decant. Audenhoen watched and listened intently from his seat toward the rear of the command deck as Captain Chenyu Hung tugged rapidly at the long beard growth below his chin. Captain Sild, do you concur? Hung asked, leaving the final decision to the de facto fleet commander. Tie formation? Audenhoen thought to himself, having never heard the term used concerning Star Destroyer deployment. Acknowledge Tagata Taia. Preliminary intelligence suggests redeployment of insurgent vessels, which is an excellent preventative tactic, Captain. Sild's voice responded, warped through hyperspace travel and interference. Listen up, everyone, Hung said, clearing his voice and directing what he would say next to the entirety of Tagata Taia's crew. I want top-deck gunnery crews working back up for our main batteries. We'll be coming in hot and firing at will. I repeat, at will. No quarter shown, no quarter given. Audenhoen felt the commonality of the captain's statement and knew it would have been wasted breath aboard a vessel bearing the crest of the Imperial Navy. However, as he looked around, he could see the impact distinct orders were having on those who respected their source. These officers, this crew, weren't assigned to the Tagata Taia. They were hand-picked for the honor. Audenhoen thought to himself in realization, watching as everyone took up their stations with rapt attention and severe demeanor. By whom? He finished the thought with a question that would nag at him till solved. Hung or Sild? He said aloud, though not loud enough to be heard. 7. Please refresh the asset position near and around the target destination. Present insurgent locations would also be helpful if the information is available. Hung spoke to the air before him, watching the inset chronometer on the console bank tick by the minutes. Refreshing now, Captain. A warbled response came as Hung swung his gaze to the tactical display. The hell is going on up there? Hung said upon inspecting the array of yellow triangles. Audenhoen got up from his seated position, placing a heavy hand on the armrest to support his aches and pains. Audenhoen saw what Hung was looking at as he approached the console bank. Interesting, was all he could find himself saying. His vision found and locked on a blue square with an unidentifiable code tag displaying CGT-1. Captain, that is an Imperial code for anything I am aware of. Because it is not military, Deputy Director. Hung responded, his gaze sweeping from the tactical display to the chronometer and back again. It is a Mon Calamari Starliner. Akbar has upgraded? Hung was confident the Deputy Director was injecting humor into the conversation, but he didn't have time for it. There is no sign of Home 1, Deputy Director. This isn't the insurgent fleet responsible for DS-1 nor the defense of Yavin. This is something else. Hung responded in a morose deadpan that lit the fuse of concern within Audenhoen. As the screen continued to refresh through Seven's efforts, increasingly coded entries came to life in their geometric simplicity. VCD, KDLC, HF, CC. Audenhoen rattled off a few entries, multiplying quickly with respective -1, -2, and so forth. Captain, insurgencies rarely resemble organized discipline. Look at how they are moving in relation to the Imperial presence and the planet itself, he expressed to Hung with a halting whisper. We have no idea what we are getting ourselves into. Hung swung his gaze back to the chronometer. 3 minutes, then slowly turned to return a whisper of his own to the Deputy Director, and they have no idea what is coming. Audenhoen stepped back from the man with a gentle push from the console bank. His eyes locked deep within Mykapan's own, and he slowly shook his head from side to side. This is a severe tactical mistake, Captain. Hung intensified his gaze as his eyes bore into the man. The mistake would only be underestimating what we are capable of. Audenhoen had not expected typical Imperial propaganda from the captain's mouth, and he adopted a pitiful expression to reflect his disappointment. Famous last words, I am sure. Every man and woman on this vessel are prepared to give their life for the mission, Deputy Director. Hung took exception. Audenhoen hadn't expected the man to bite so quickly. And therein lies the problem, Captain. He began with an uptick in volume, drawing the attention of nearby technicians and duty officers. Not every man is, he said, finding the edge of his seat again with which to relieve him of his dizziness. This, Captain, I did not expect. Not from one of the finest to Leave's press belt. The cause is something the rebels fight for, something the insurgents rally around. He paused to make sure those listening could hear clearly. Not something proper Imperial graduates, brave enlistees fly blindly into. Order is the backbone of my empire, Captain, not chaos. Chenyu Hung had no retort available, and his eyes flared a rare wave of anger. He only watched as the deputy director swiveled himself into the seat he had been using as a crutch. The emotional urge to cut the man deep with words died away in his throat as he felt the eyes of his crew on him. The captain was sure the interaction was intentional, and he had played right into the deputy's hands. He looked down briefly to discover where he had lost control of the conversation, only to see the deputy director pointing toward him when he lifted his head back up, screwing his eyes into a quizzical knot. "Time's up, Captain," Audenhoen said, lowering his finger from the inset chrono and fastening the harness built into the seat. "I've made it a point to trust you. Now I expect the same, Nindali Fardi," Oretta shouted into the comm from the Gozanti's cockpit. "He isn't what you think he is." She finished her statement, wondering if she even believed who Walker Audenhoen was. "I do trust you, Oretta Sigurn, but how would you suggest we get him off that ship?" Nindali returned via comlink from the vessel's aft cargo bay. "I am still working on that." Already trailed off with no more answers now than she had earlier while working through the same problem. "I was hoping you could come up with something." "And it isn't as if we can simply pick him up already," Ndali continued, already wondering if she had even listened to her reply. "If your version of events is accurate, he will want to remain seated in his position. There may not be a limit to his ambitions at this point," Ndali thought aloud. "He hasn't expressed that desire at any point since we've left Coruscant, Ndali. He even suggested the directorship was a ruse," Already returned. "Perhaps, but this man sounds more interested in truth than personal achievement." Already scrunched her eyes into themselves. "That doesn't even make sense. If not for personal achievement, why pursue the directorship?" "Truth, Already Sigurn. There is nothing more powerful in the galaxy. There is nothing more worthy to fight for," Ndali said after a few moments of introspection. "Perhaps you're right," Already finally conceded, knowing that Ndali would begin drawing parallels to her circumstances and present location. "And if I am, he will need you more than ever." Already could only stare through the canopy as improbability began to take hold of her. Her actions were spawned by a desire to uncover the truth at its core, and she began to understand why insurgencies took on a life of their own and became worthy initiatives. It is the responsibility of those that can do something, to do something. Already mumbled to herself, reciting the phrase Walker had forged into her memory for years. "Pardon?" Ndali intoned over the comm. "Nothing. I just said I agree with you," Already returned, her focused stare drawn fully into the twisting nexus of hyperspace. Her mind scrambled for answers to help her determine how she had gotten to this point or what lay beyond. The pit of her stomach churned violently as she realized her unlikely partnership would more than likely lead directly to her death, specifically with the precise company she was in. This Thebeskin's intrusion into what should have been another day at the office had led her down this path. Yet there was a comfort within that very knowledge that began to settle her nerves just as it had set them on edge. Already had no idea what lay before them at Ambria, only that there was no returning from whence she came. She began to shake her head from side to side lightly with the knowledge that her life was entirely in Ndali's hands. She quickly glanced towards the chronometer within the ship's control console. "Ndali, we have another hour before Takent. Any idea what we're flying into?" "Only what could be. I haven't been able to isolate confirmation encryption yet." Already wasn't sure how to feel about Thebeskin's inability to decipher Imperial encryption, given what she already knew of Ndali. Still, she felt some comfort in knowing she was at least working on the issue. "Okay, let's start with what you do know." Ndali was silent momentarily before her voice crackled through the comm, a monotone devoid of emotion. "Fifth Fleet, elements of others. Grand Admiral Tethys is present, and Evan Sild is on his way." "Fifth Fleet? Lord Vader himself?" Already asked herself more than Ndali. What could prompt such attention? Therein lies the answer we both seek, Already. Already contemplated the Imperial presence for several long moments, calculating the magnitude of the firepower present and what intentions could be made to utilize it. Planetary bombardment? She closed her eyes in thought, as she visualized the broad scope of Imperial installations throughout the galaxy. Unless there is an insurgent presence on Ambria that I am not aware of, there would be no gain in the planet's destruction. There's nothing there. Already formulated the conclusion to her thoughts aloud. "Precisely what is eluding me," Ndali returned. Already thought through her answer, noting the formality of its diction. "Ndali, what do you feel is there?" Ndali didn't respond immediately. A long silence followed, and Already could only hear the constant thrum of the ship's hyperdrive, coursing through its framework and the occasional chime pinging her ears from various instruments set within the control console. "Already," Ndali began after some time, The monotone was lost to the human as the simple recitation of her name was spoken with the same emotion and conviction displayed by the Thebescan through their original conversation. My friends, my sisters are there, and if the Empire is as well, they are in trouble. Already understood the implication, but wasn't eager to assign mutual exclusivity to both elements. One faction was there because of the other, to her knowledge. She was missing something, and by default, so was Ndali. She was sure there had to be a third element neither of them was aware of. Ndali, what if this is something else? I am listening, Ndali responded immediately, the emotion continuing in her voice. Have we ruled out planetary bombardment? I believe so, yes, Ndali replied. Then any present insurgency is there because of the Imperial presence. The Empire, is looking for something. Or someone, already deduced. I'll buy that, Ndali chimed in with increasing enthusiasm, which means any insurgent presence would know what they are getting into, to a point. What do you mean? Already asked, unsure whether insurgent groups possessed the detail this Thebescan could determine. Evan Sild, Ndali said immediately. They do not know he is coming. Already understood the implications of their impending involvement. But we do. Yes, already Sigurn. We do, Ndali said, already sensing the unforced smile on the dark woman's face as she heard the words. The stinging of airborne dust and particulate sands continued to pelt her face and bore into her montrol as Ahsoka lowered herself into a more stable position atop the AT-ST. She could sense the swirling winds were something far more than natural occurrence, as they continually whirled into eddies that drew up more of the blinding sands and dirt fragments, pinging them violently into the duranium framework of the walker she rode atop. She distinguished her sabers and drew out a length of cloth from the small pack at her side, wrapping it tightly about her face, leaving a small crease within the folds to allow sight. She squinted her eyes to take in the view, becoming more central to her immediate position and little else. The clang and scrape of metallic roofs just below her position told her the occupants had finally given up on visual perception, relying instead on instruments and navigation equipment. The thundering of nearby field artillery began to subside, and it was replaced with the whipping of vicious hot winds that seemed to emanate from the ground and blow straight up. Ahsoka heard the violent crackle of balmy air collide with the cooler air above, driving piercing stabs of white-hot electricity back into the ground at random intervals from the overabundance of static clinging to the air. The motion of the AT-ST slowed in its forward advancement as the old clone navigated around rocky protrusions, dried crevice, and pitching terrain toward its larger cousins in the distance, their thunder not lost in the unnatural winds as they methodically drew near. Although assured of her footing, Ahsoka closed her eyes to concentration. As she pushed her reach deep into the Force, she could place the fighters flying blindly above her and the multitude of ground forces making their way westward, ineffective as they tried vainly to find openings in the storm. Their screaming ion engines call out to their uselessness with every pass overhead. A sudden and intense sense of foreboding coursed through her body as she lowered herself even farther upon the walker, a palm pressed wide to brace herself from the waves of discombobulation gripping her consciousness and balance. She heard the advancing scream of ion engines again, but noted the higher pitch within as the sound faded without passing overhead. Time stopped in its forward progression as her eyes flew open in comprehension, aided again by an unseen ally as the vortex of swirling debris clouds receded to reveal the forward cockpit of the stationary TIE advanced. Ahsoka did not wait as she leapt from atop the AT-ST and rolled to an awkward stop on one knee, with her left hand planted on the solid, rocky ground. She had only the moment to turn her head toward the walker as the TIE unleashed bright green bursts of laser fire into the armored cockpit of the vehicle, reducing it to an explosive flash of white and orange as remnant shrapnel rained down all about her. Ahsoka swung her gaze back toward the fighter as realization took hold. She knew precisely who was piloting the craft. Nara squeezed her eyes shut as she projected the sphere encapsulating her prone form from the cascading fingers of lightning that exploded into the ground about her with dull thuds. She put more effort into the waves of clarity as she thrust toward Ahsoka. She sensed what Ahsoka could as the forward portion of the fighter's cockpit was revealed through the swirling debris, and knew as Ahsoka did who was piloting the starfighter. She sensed Kawani lowering the targeting reticule on the helmet to line up her next shot into the exposed fighter as she slowed her breathing to stretch further into her meditation. Excellent, Nara. You can not only see but foresee, Zana whispered into her mind. The more you exert your will upon your objective, the more favorable the outcome will be, she continued. Nara hesitated, conjuring scenarios not unlike the relationship she had recently ended with Sidious. That sounds all too familiar, mistress, she responded to the wayward spirit in thought. No, Nara. Exert your will upon your objective, not upon the Force. There is a vast difference, Zana responded without hesitation. Let the Force guide your endeavor and nothing more. Nara felt the truth of Zana's words flow through her as she let the Force itself course through her body without hindrance. Again, she was able to see not only what was transpiring, but also what would. She felt the passage of time slow to a crawl as she placed her calm and composure into the Myrialand's actions at her side. The foresight to see what would happen to Ahsoka would depend on the success of Kawani's marksmanship, the image flowing through her entirely. Time stopped altogether as Kawani drew in her breath to hold it for a shot, and with a last-second effort, Nara could part the debris cloud long enough for a clear line of sight right into the starboard solar anchor of the TIE Advanced. A thunderous report of a modified A-180 returned time to normal as the rifle muzzle flared with a single white-hot burst of furious energy right into the anchor support and housing mechanisms constructed to keep the ship together. With a glorious flare of reds, yellows, and bright oranges, the starboard solar wing burst apart into a cascading effect that backlit the returning swirl of gusting sands. The ship fell straight into the rocky surface below it with a crash of metal that overtook the increasing intensity of the wind surrounding them. The eerie effect of multiple secondary explosions within the debris storm, reminiscent of distant nebulae, could not hide the image of a solitary figure clad in black strolling through the chaos and straight toward Ahsoka. He knew this day would come. He had willed it into existence. How fate had worked its tragic poem directly into his hands could not be understated. He saw her push herself up from the ground, only to cast a casual hand on her hip, as he watched the wrappings about her head flutter in a silent wind that obscured her vision in flashes, before returning out of the desert storm. He could not help but draw comparisons to his youth, despite his most significant efforts to remove himself from the child of Tatooine. Each time, the image of his former Padawan was exposed to the circling debris clouds. She was 2 steps closer to him. He could feel the contempt raging through her, the unabating anger coursing through her blood as she waged war within for control of the emotion. He could sense the raw, naked hatred she was trying so urgently to reject and flush away. He sensed the equal amount of determination she was contemplating to give in to the dark side completely as the ground began to quiver under his feet. Without removing his helmeted vision from the approaching Tagata, he called upon the Force to snap his lightsaber back into his waiting hand and ignite it, bathing the advancing tension in a renewed eeriness of backlit fury. He halted his progression, conscious of the appearance of his approach in the foreground, of the continuing explosions his fighter was doomed to behind him. She did not stop advancing. Kawani opened her eyes after releasing the trigger, aware that something else had aided her aim. However, she could only watch on through her reticule as the black figure somersaulted itself from the explosive downfall its fighter had become. She watched as it came to rest on its feet with a crouched landing and slowly rose to them, the fireball its fighter had become, illuminating a radial visage with it at its center. She slowly swung her gaze towards Ahsoka, and could only open her mouth as she saw her friend slowly advancing on the figure without missing a step. No, Ahsoka, let it go, she said to herself, fear tugging at her instincts over the prophetic plea the Tagata had sensed enough to share earlier. Don't give in to it, she pleaded as she pounded the side of her helmet to activate the comlink, even knowing Ahsoka wouldn't reach for it at her waist, not in her present state. Rex shook his head as he slowly lowered the quad knocks, their ability to deliver close images sending wavering pulses of dread through his aging body. He had never bothered to wonder what he would think or how he would react in Skywalker's presence, how he would feel or what he would do. Finely worked ribbons of anger began filtering their way through the siphon of his mind, betraying the oaths he had committed himself to prevent them. He knew his attachment to his old general was something he could never rid himself of, but was surprised nonetheless by the raging aggression that gripped him now, the intent to tear the man apart the way they had done in tandem with advancing clankers. Internal warnings flared their survival instincts as he felt a burning urge to take up his place in duty and honor beside Ahsoka, who was advancing on the cybernetic mutation of his former general. The man who had saved him from countless deadly encounters and trials against numerous mechanical threats and enemies had become one himself. A ruthless harbinger of the Emperor's fancy. The man had since ceased being a man, Rex knew, and proceeded down an irrevocable path of doom and destruction in his wake. Be careful, Ahsoka, he found himself saying as he felt a hand on his shoulder. Turning, He felt the winds cool the tear falling from his eye, which he hadn't been aware of as he investigated Kawani's shaded visor. He could only pat her hand as he turned back to watch Ahsoka advancing on Darth Vader in the distance. She felt the tugging of the facial wrap as it pulled at her lecu and mantrol in the forceful winds, not away from her goal, but toward him. She felt it, strange in the absence of fear, how calm she was, owing in some part to Nara's efforts, but also through a sense of self that overpowered anything else she believed she should have felt. Master Yoda, guide my strength so I may stay my hand. The words came to mind without thought given to them as she continued her progress toward the man she would otherwise unwittingly usher into the next life, if given to her instinct alone. Within 5 meters, Vader ignited his saber, bathing himself in its crimson aura. The swirling dust clouds obscured the hem of his cape and heavy boots in their sweeping embrace. Ahsoka paused only to place her hands around the hilts of her sabers, never taking her cloaked eyes from the black orbs of his helmet. You are not welcome here. Take your forces and leave this place while you still draw breath, she said as she slowed her pace a meter from his unmoving stance. Threats do not become you, apprentice. Vader responded through his vocator in rhythmic breaths of forced oxygen, keeping a measured cadence of both heart rate and temperament. Ahsoka did not respond immediately, waiting to come within striking distance before placing foot over foot to move around her target to the right and away from his dominant hand. The pulsing hum of his activated saber reached through the operational chaos of whipping winds and blaster fire that hadn't slowed. Green, blue, and red bursts of energy trading places and direction through the swirling sands above and around her, changing her perspective by the second as they cast their radiant glows, his helmet swiveling to maintain eye contact with her. I haven't been your apprentice since you took it upon yourself to dismantle the Jedi Order, Anakin. Do not think for an instant your manipulations will work on me. She had so much to say to him, but was decidedly malpracticed in linguistic competition to engage with him very long. She could feel him probing her senses and emotions, trying to insert his psyche within her own mind to battle her thoughts. She felt pity for the man, she admitted to herself as she casually thwarted his attempts with almost laughable ease. Do you not see, Anakin? Do you not see that this confrontation contrasts your fate and destiny? She said with a little more conviction as she decided to dissuade his efforts through their own manipulations. I promised you a death I have not yet carried out, apprentice. A promise you are powerless to deliver upon, she retorted as the resonance of his voice died on the winds. She reached his prone side and stopped, successfully swiveling her opponent to position her back toward his friends. Do not fool yourself into a sense of security or a position of control, Ahsoka. Vader paused to give his suit a moment to regulate his breath. I know what lies behind me. He finished, bearing his saber across his chest to let it rest toward his left, his armor reflecting the crimson arc across his breastplate. And that is precisely where she'll stay, she said without thinking through the statement. She doesn't belong to you or your master. Search your feelings, Anakin. You know how this will end. The tip of his saber lowered to the ground as his grip relaxed, dropping his shoulder. Ahsoka saw her opportunity but hesitated, knowing he wouldn't offer any opening without reason. Despite what you've been led to believe, I am not here for her, Vader said unexpectedly as he did the unthinkable and deactivated his saber. Ahsoka could feel her mouth drop open as the inrush of scenarios actively playing out in her mind expanded tenfold. Her eyes tried to convince her that what she saw was a ruse as the winds died enough to hear the extinguishing blade return to its hilt with electronic finality. The creaking of her former master's sin leather suit betrayed her imagination as his dominant hand returned the hilt to his waist. She could only stare in disbelief as he lowered the gaze slightly and lifted that same lowered hand toward her with the palm extended upward, his fingers splayed open. The winds tore at the head wrap and pelted the exposed skin on her arms with particulates, and she was oblivious to the chaotic sounds that died in her ears. A silence fell between the two amid the raging battle that transpired despite them. Thin wisps of debris filled snake through between them as they stared at each other. She in wonderment of his purpose, he on the precipice of revelation. His regulator offered a final exhale that seemed to Ahsoka to ring with its finality. Where is my son?